Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're calling, Joel, we're going to call this the Zeitgeist. We have with us today Jeff Jones from Gallup. Jeff is a senior editor and has been a senior editor there for their public release surveys since 2000. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, our last guest, Dr. Jim Doty, is a well-known economist and gave us the quantitative view of the economy and where things are going. But today we wanted to focus in on kind of a more qualitative view of what's going on out there, what are people feeling like, and how that might reflect the future of both society and the economy. Joel, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is a very strange economy in that it has high inflation, low unemployment, and all these external factors. What's the public mood? What's the mood of the consumer in what you're looking at?
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the kind of strange nature of the economy we have. And I think it's good because when we ask people how they evaluate the economy, they net it out pretty negatively. So some good, some bad, but on balance, they're quite negative. In fact, they haven't been this negative since the very end of the Great Recession. So our economic confidence index in June, it was negative 58. That was the worst we had measured since February of 2009, which, at that time, those were the record low numbers that we had ever recorded.
Well, just for context, just for context's sake, what does that negative 58 mean? What's the upside? How good can it get?
So that measure, it has a theoretical range. I don't know that we'd ever reach, the top and bottom of the range, but it can range from negative 100 at the lowest to plus 100 at the highest. And basically, we summarize people's opinions on two questions. The first is an evaluation of current economic conditions. And the second is their assessment of whether the economy is getting better or worse. So we kind of summarize between those two. The lowest, I don't have the exact figure, but probably during the Great Recession, maybe it was negative 80. So that's kind of the bottom. The top hasn't gotten that high. We were, before COVID hit, I think we're at plus 41. So that was the highest we had been since 2000. So I think the record high might have been like plus in the 50s or 60s on the positive. And so negative 58, definitely bad. Our that's not our latest update. That was from June to July. It was negative 51. So it was slightly better, but still, that would also be the worst since 2009.
Well, when you peel it back and you kind of look at the constituent parts of what makes it negative or positive, what is it that people are really honing in on that makes it as negative as it is?
It's definitely inflation, far and away. So we know that because we have another question that we ask every month. It's asking people to say what the most important problem facing the country is. And inflation is definitely right at the top there. The other top issue that people mention is the government. That's been kind of there for a while now, but inflation has really emerged this year, especially. For many years, given where inflation was, hardly anybody would mention inflation as the most important problem. Most months we get 1% or less. Now we're 17, 18 the last few months. That's the highest mentioning inflation since 1982. That was the last time it was higher on that measure. So it's something we haven't seen in a long time. That's the question that asks about the most important problem facing the country. We have a similar question that asks people the most important problem facing their family and their family's finances. And not surprising, inflation is the number one there as well. We had 32% mentioning that this year when we asked that question. That was the highest we've ever measured for that. So clearly inflation, is driving this.
Are there particular groups by age, sex, race, part of the country that are showing this more than others?
There are. One thing that we look at, and it's a little bit surprising, is we don't see much difference by income. So lower income, higher income are about equally likely to mention inflation as the top problem. Where we really see a difference, and this might not be surprising, is political. And it's probably given the messages that people are getting, obviously their partisanship will color how they view conditions in the country to some extent. So Republicans, a lot more likely to mention inflation than Democrats are.
Are there particular government policies or concerns that people voice besides the ability or inability to control inflation?
In terms of the most important problem,
Yeah.
you mean? That's kind of the biggest one. We get more so in recent years. I mean, certainly not to level of inflation is, race relations is a problem that people often mention, healthcare, immigration, those typically, we get a decent number of people mentioning those, but it's certainly not, at the high end where inflation is, and the government, that's kind of, like I mentioned, kind of a chronic complaint, the government over the last decade or so. It's always kind of ranked as one of the top problems.
One of the
I'm
things
sure.
I'm sorry.
Well, the question I had is, I'm sure you do a lot of regression analysis on the indicator value of your metric with actual real world economic data. Have you done that work, and how closely tied is this metric to what actually happens in the economy?
Yeah, we haven't done a lot ourselves. We've done some in the past, not real recent. Typically what we found is it, has maybe a small contribution to what happens in the economy. I think a lot of what we're picking up is people's kind of just, they kind of see what's going on, if unemployment is high, if inflation is high, if gas prices are high, if the economy is in a recession, they kind of pick that up. So we kind of think about consumer confidence as maybe a leading indicator, but it may be more of kind of like a trailing indicator as well, just kind of reflecting what's going on in the economy. So if you look at other factors that kind of move the economy, consumer confidence usually isn't that strong. I think, and this is maybe the way people think about it, is kind of, it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people think the economy is getting worse, maybe they're going to pull back on spending.
Right.
They pull back on spending, economic growth goes down, suddenly we're in a recession. So, that's one thing where I think it could matter. But, as far as like the analysis of the measure, it doesn't, seem to be that predictive necessarily. The way we see it, we kind of just like to take a pulse on where people are and kind of document, what people think about the economy. And that allows us to do these kind of historical comparisons to see, where people are now and how that compares to the past. So that's kind of our main interest in it, just kind of measuring what people think and reporting on that.
One of the things I notice in your polls is the incredibly low level of trust in government. I mean, and in major institutions, universities, the media. Has that been trending for a long time? And what do you think the implications of that are?
Yeah, it's been going on for a while. I mean, a lot of people kind of maybe point to Donald Trump and his administration, but it definitely precedes that. I would probably pinpoint it back to maybe the second Bush term, where we had obviously the Iraq War, we had Katrina. There were other issues that the Bush administration was kind of struggling to handle. So we go back to like 2005, and that's kind of when we started to see a real decline in trust in the government and key U.S. institutions. It's kind of persisted, since then. We haven't seen too much movement in a positive direction. I would say the most we saw was kind of tied to COVID. It's kind of like, this crisis was happening in the country, and people were starting to rally around certain institutions that were affected by COVID, healthcare system, small business, that sort of thing. So there was kind of more like idiosyncratic, but that was, the kind of thing that could kind of reverse the decline. that we're seeing. So we've just kind of been stuck here for a while. I think the economy plays into that as well. If the economy is not doing well, people, are just more negative on, a lot of things, including, their belief in institutions. Yes, about the implications of that. I think it's one of the reasons that George Gallup started measuring confidence in institutions back in the 70s, because it's so important in a democracy, because the government isn't responsible for doing everything in society. We rely on a lot of institutions, government and non-governmental, to kind of, keep the country going, keep people safe, make sure everybody is kind of having their interests looked out for. And, without that kind of confidence, it's, just hard to have a healthy democracy. I mean, we certainly, one specific institution we talk about is the media, and trust in the media is so low, but the media plays such an important role in the democracy, in informing people, and people not being able to trust what the media is saying. It certainly has kind of serious implications for our democracy.
Is that unprecedented, or is that something that's just been building up over time?
Yeah, I would say it's been building up, but in the last few years we've hit lows. I think 2016 was a low point. 2014, 2016, those were kind of years where we hit low points. We have different measures of trust and confidence, and those were kind of the years where we kind of bottomed out. So we're not quite as low as we were then, but we're certainly lower than we were, say, in the 1990s and 1980s on a lot of these things. And, like I said, we haven't seen much kind of indication that those trends are reversing, really.
Are you seeing this polarity trend in the polls that you do? Like it just seems that society is splitting itself into polar, nodes. And that, some people think that things are really great. Some people think that it's really awful. I mean, how do you deal with that as a pollster? And are you even noticing that?
Yeah, we definitely notice it in a lot of places. The most obvious for us, because we study it so much, is presidential approval ratings. So if you, historically, there's always been a gap. Republicans are more positive about Republican presidents and less positive about Democrats, and same with Democrats and Democratic presidents versus Republican presidents. But what we're seeing now, just the split between how parties evaluate the president are so stark. We're talking about, with one group maybe in the single digit approval, and the other group 80-90% approval. So what's different now, though, people have always been supportive of a president of their own party. So to see Democrats with 80-90% approval of Biden, or Republicans with those same approval of Trump, is not different. But what's different is on the other end. Whereas, if you go back to the 1980s, you might have had 30% of Democrats approving of the job Reagan was doing. And if you go even further back, Eisenhower, maybe 40 or 50% of Democrats were approving of Eisenhower. Now, when Trump comes in day one, it's like 10% approval among Democrats. Biden comes in day one, 10% approval among Republicans. So it's just kind of the other side that has really kind of caused this, as you said, like this polarity, we call it polarization, to happen. I would say when we talk about the economy, since that's, kind of what we're talking about here, we do see that as well. But in our studying of it, party only goes so far in how people evaluate the economy. So right now, Democrats, they're not denying that there are problems with the economy. I think just checking, like the last poll, 30% of Democrats said the economy was getting better and 63% getting worse. So they're not really denying the reality here, but certainly Republicans are much more negative about the economy than Democrats are. So that's kind of an important point I like to make. If you look at just how the parties rate it, you would assume that this is all partisanship. But when you look at the trends over time by party, you see the lines kind of moving up and down. So there's always a party gap, but it's, if the economy is good, both parties groups will move up, and rate the economy better. If the economy is bad, both groups will move down and rate it worse. So, the partisanship is kind of checked by reality, to a large degree here. So, the economy is one where, it's not just fully party driven, the kind of the real world and what's going on, what people are experiencing, that kind of plays into it as well.
How fickle are these numbers? So, in the sense of, like, in the last month or so, we've seen gasoline prices go down significantly. And historically, that's been a big indicator of people's mood about inflation. Mm-hmm. Are we likely to expect to see a big swing up in or down in the how people rate inflation as an important factor in the economy? Is it that sensitive, that fickle, or is it something that these confidence numbers just kind of endure?
I would say probably more that it would be enduring, but I mentioned that our July numbers were slightly better than our June numbers. So I think that could be tied to gas prices starting to ease. When we get our August data, we might even see kind of more of an easing. But when you look at some of these over time, it takes a while for people to kind of change their opinion about the economy. So, 91, 92 recession, it wasn't really until 96 where people started to say, hey, the economy is pretty good here. And the same thing with, the Great Recession. It was probably 2012 before people started to think, hey, maybe the economy isn't as bad as we thought. I mean, I think in both instances that could have been tied to the presidential election year and people kind of being forced to, evaluate things closely, because they have to make a decision about, whether to reelect an incumbent president. So, that could force it, but it definitely takes a long time. It's not something that certainly happens overnight. And even with inflation, it wasn't until last fall where we started to see mentions of inflation as the most important problem pick up, and then by, after a lot of news coverage of it, by the time you get to the beginning of this year, that's when it was kind of rising to the top problem that people were mentioning.
Go ahead, Joel.
Are you seeing similar things? I mean, you do international polling. Are people in other countries experiencing the same polarization and alienation, or are some countries doing better, some worse?
Yeah, I'm certainly not the expert on our international data, but I do know that, in some of the confidence measures that we measure internationally, things, don't look much better than they do in the US. Certainly, in some countries they're quite a bit worse than what we see in the US, even though the US is kind of on the low end. I mean, there's countries where, confidence institution is much worse than it is here. And, I'm sure there's some that are.
Who's on the high end? I mean, I'm sure China, they get very high ratings.
I'm sure Ukraine is really way up there right now.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the international data to confidently answer that question. I know we've done some polling in Afghanistan, and that was one of the ones on the low end, so that's not surprising. But on the high end, I'm not quite as sure off the top of my head what those.
Let me ask you a quick methodology question, because I'm sure our listeners kind of wonder about this stuff. Gallup is considered to be the gold standard in quantitative marketing research. Mm-hmm. How many people do you have to interview and have them respond to your questionnaire in order to be able to get the kind of accuracy that you get with your work?
Yeah, we typically will interview 1,000 people for our survey, and we've been doing that for a while. So that'll give you a margin of sampling error of 3-4%. Typically it's been 4 now, since we've kind of introduced cell phones that kind of affected the methodology a little bit. But yeah, that's good. And sometimes we'll do less, and the numbers are pretty stable. We're oftentimes surprised at how stable these numbers are. Just it comes down to the power of like random sampling, and you just have a sample that gives everybody in the country a chance to be in the survey, and just kind of stick to those rigorous methods. And you find that when things for the most part attitudes are pretty stable, but we do find changes, and when we see changes, a lot of times they make a lot of sense given what's going on in the real world. So we have a lot of confidence in it, and it's just I've heard some people, and maybe it was my old boss, just the miracle of random sampling and being able to do this, and just how accurate it tends to be.
What have been the biggest changes that you've noticed in the last few years, in terms of people's attitudes?
Yeah. So are you talking like substantively?
Yeah, I mean, how have people changed? I mean, obviously your polling has to be
Mhm.
different now because, you have to reflect a much larger Hispanic and Asian population,
Mhm.
for instance, a much bigger elderly population.
Yeah, we've seen some pretty big shifts in the last few years. A lot of them have to do with moral values issues. So I'm not sure if it's necessarily a moral values issue, but support for same-sex marriage. We started asking about that in the 90s, and you had about 25% who were in favor of it. And even as recently as 2004, you had a majority opposed. And now we've got 70% in favor of same-sex marriage. So that's a big one. Another big one that we've seen is support for legal marijuana, which I think when we first asked about it, it might have been in the single digits.
Wow.
And now we've got, I think, about 2/3 who are in favor of it. A lot of that, I think, is tied to like generational change. Just, the younger generations coming through are more liberal, I guess, for lack of a better word, than the older generations that they're replacing. So you see that reflected in a lot of the things that we measure. But some of it, I think this applies to same-sex marriage as well, just changing kind of societal mores, and just the way people are kind of thinking about issues differently. So a lot of on those kind of moral values issues, we've seen a lot of change, certainly in, I guess it's somewhat related to this, just religious behavior. It's, declined so much compared to, what Gallup was measuring even just like 2 decades ago in terms of people, having a religious preference, attending religious service, belonging to a religious institution has just really fallen, and it's really being driven by these younger generations who just aren't very religious at all. So those are the things. And we also talked too about the trust in institutions. That's one that we've been measuring for a long time, and definitely things are different now than they used to be.
Do you talk or question about the impact of social media on people's lives?
We haven't done too much with that. I've been involved in maybe a couple public release projects for clients that touched on that. Certainly that's more common among younger people. People tend to have a negative view of it, especially when we get into, like, as we did in these projects, like social media as a news source. People are very negative about what they see on social media, even though, a lot of people use it as a news source, but they just don't trust it. And we talked about lack of trust in the news media. Well, lack of trust in news that people see on social media is even worse. So, that's kind of the main things that we've done with social media, I think.
Well, if we were ask you, what would be the trends that you think are the ones to watch in the next year or so? What would be the things that come to mind for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, we want to continue monitoring like confidence in institutions. That's very important. I think politically, we really don't see as much change in presidential job approval as we used to. That's always something that we've kept a close eye on, but we do know that presidential approval and indicators of the mood of the nation, such as the economy, such as satisfaction with the way things are going, those tend to be very good predictors of election outcomes. So in the past, where we used to ask people who you're going to vote for and kind of come up with a likely voter model and use that as prediction, you can do pretty good just kind of saying, okay, what's the president's approval rating? How satisfied are people with the way things are going? What's party ID looking like in the country? Because that, definitely moves depending on, how things are going in the country. So those are, some of the core things that we track, and, just a lot of these generational changes that I've talked about. It's kind of driving a lot of the change we're seeing in the aggregate, kind of trying to keep an eye on Gen Z because some of them have reached adulthood, but a lot of them haven't. So interested to see how the portion of Gen Z that hasn't reached adulthood, how they're going to look when they do reach adulthood, what their, political views are going to be like, what their, religious behaviors are going to be like. Are they going to be trusting in institutions or not? So, that's something we're definitely kind of monitoring too.
And what about the data itself? Is there a trend line emerging? If we were to, following on Joel's question, if we were to look at, say, the next year, would you expect that you would see an improvement in people's, optimism about the economy or pessimism about the economy? Is there a trend line emerging?
I think it's really going to be tied to what happens. I think if inflation eases and, certainly gas prices is such an important thing, I think, for people's evaluations of the economy, because it kind of hits them right in the face, right? Unemployment, if you lose a job, obviously that's a big deal, but if you keep working but unemployment is high, the unemployment doesn't affect you as much. Same with economic growth, that's like so remote from people. But gas prices, and inflation too, you go to the grocery store, you're paying more. That's a big, hard to escape that. So I think if a lot of it's going to be tied to what happens. So if inflation eases, I think people will become more optimistic. Certainly we talked about good things in the economy are, people's evaluation of the job market now, that's near record highs. 71% last time we asked it said it was a good time to find a quality job. The all-time high is 74, so we're near the high there. Economic growth, we've had some periods in the last couple of years where it was strong and others where it's weak, including the last two quarters. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that is kind of fascinating. We talked about polling and random sampling and that sort of thing, but one of the other thing that sticks out to me is kind of people pay attention to what's going on, and then we see the movement. So I think ultimately with the economic trends, it's going to be driven by how the economy is doing. We did talk too about how these tend to be enduring, but I think inflation is such a strong signal that if there's dramatic changes in there, we'll see that movement quicker than if people are evaluating the economy based on economic growth or something else that's kind of more remote.
Yeah. Well, and given the impact of inflation on people's attitudes, I suspect that where we are today, which is basically early September 2022, if things get better in the next couple of months, it could have some serious political implications coming up.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, we have a couple recent examples. 1994 and 2010, it looked very bad for Clinton and Obama to get reelected. And 2 years later, Clinton won easily and Obama won relatively easily. So 2 years is not a long time in politics to turn things around. And we've seen the opposite too. George W. Bush, in 1991, he was flying high, and then, 18 months later, he's being kicked out of office. So, things can change really quickly. So, I mean, it certainly looks like this year is going to be a better year for Republicans, but, 2024 could be very different than 2022.
Well, Jeff, we want to thank you. This is very helpful information, and I think our guests will probably come away thinking it's a toss-up. It all kind of depends on inflation and some of these other economic underlying trends. But thank you very much for the work that you do, and thank you for having been a guest on the Feudal Future podcast.
Sure, my pleasure.
Thank you, Jeff.